of the relationships between some of these tech companies and international surveillance agencies, not only including the NSA, but actually including ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement within that. You know, when we actually hear about your story, a lot of folks say that you work for the NSA, but actually your employer, right, was a company, Booz Allen Hamilton, which is a corporation that also seems to be making technical tools for ICE, right? And specifically right now, one of the tools we've been very concerned about has been this tool Raven, which is a data analytic tool where ICE can both process lots of information from government agencies, but they can also tap into private sources of data that come through third-party companies, right? For example, Thomson Reuters. They can even integrate facial recognition technology that comes from companies like Clearview that are using our images that have been scraped from the internet and from our Facebook profiles and other places. So can you just talk to us a little bit about what are the relationships that are forming between corporations like Palantir, Thomson Reuters, Northrop Grumman, and these surveillance agencies like the NSA and ICE? What are the concerns that you might have about this system, and whether or not you think it's a fair assessment to be concerned that all of our biometrics, information, and location data is being stored not only by federal agencies, but also by private companies?
Yeah. No, I mean, of course, all of our data is being mismanaged and mishandled and misappropriated by companies around the world, both institutions around the world, both governmental and corporate. You mentioned sort of my corporate background in intelligence, and this is something that I think is opaque, and it's not understood by a lot of people who haven't been in government, and particularly in the intelligence community, or IC as they call it, where it's become really the standard of business. And this opacity, this lack of transparency is entirely by design. Because what it means is, I would be willing to say the majority of the most important work done by the CIA, by the NSA, maybe not the DIA, but most of the big dogs, and increasingly actually when we're talking about digital operations and cyber, the cyber domain as the government calls it. Most people say just crimes involving computers, but they like to make up their own words for it. In places like the FBI, we see this happening with DHS, Department of Homeland Security. And of course, I don't follow it as closely, so people on this call may be able to speak to it much more precisely than I can. But places like ICE and CBP, that work is being done by contractors. So I began my intelligence career as a contractor for the National Security Agency, which actually meant I was just a security guard at a university that had a facility that was actually doing top secret work. That got me a top secret clearance. I then went to a job fair that was like called Top Secret USA or like Tech Expo or something like that, where you couldn't even walk in the doors of these places without a resume that said you had a top secret clearance on it. But once you're in there, they're giving you jobs or offering jobs that aren't in a corporate office somewhere. I got hired by a small company called ComSo, which was subcontracting to a larger company called British Aerospace. And they were actually putting me in the building at the CIA headquarters building that you see, all of the, movies and things like that. I went into a government office. I did government work on government equipment every day. And the only difference between a government employee and me was they had a blue badge and I had a green badge. And then I moved from contract to government. I got a blue badge. I went overseas. I went undercover. I worked out of embassies in places like Geneva, Switzerland. Then I went back to being a contractor, now working for Dell, people who make the monitor sitting on your desk, probably. And then eventually I changed to Booz Allen Hamilton. And the idea is there's very much a revolving door and there's very little separation between the work that is done by private companies. These people are not government employees. They're not protected by the same processes. They have their own rules. Formally, a government official can't even instruct them to do something or not do something. They have to go through a contract manager who then is supposed to tell the contractor to do this, that, or the other. But in reality, no one actually pays attention to these formal processes that were laid out by Congress and in procurement law and things like that. Because think about it. You work at the CIA. You work at the NSA. Regardless of whether you think they're good guys or bad guys, and there's some truth to both sides of that, these people all believe they have the most important job in the world. They believe they're pushing back the darkness of a grim and dangerous world every single day, no matter what they're doing, even if they're fixing printers, right? And you've got 10 people on a team, and 7 of them have green badges, and 3 of them have blue badges, and you have something that must be done. Are you really going to go outside of the office, email some guy who doesn't work in the building, who's never met your team, who doesn't know all this stuff, and wait for it to trickle down to do this, that, and the other? Are you going to tell the contractor, hey, go do this? And the way that actually works in real life, the contractor-governmental divide, in the way this work is done, the only thing separating someone who works for Dell from firing a missile from a drone and a government staffer doing it, or breaking the law, hacking into computers in other countries, or in our own, is what they call inherently governmental functions. I, as a contractor, could do anything. In my final position, I worked directly with the tools of mass surveillance, the database of everything that's ingested every single day, by the minute, into the entire NSA's network and the network of their international partners. This is called the Five Eyes Surveillance Network. It's the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. They put the bulk of all the collection that they perform everywhere in the world into a common bucket that anybody can sort through. These are sort of the baseball cards that are listing the statistics of all of our lives that are generated by what you're typing into your cell phone right now, by the live stream that you're connected to. Even when you're not doing anything, the cell phone is just riding through your pocket, connecting to cell phone tower after cell phone tower, because that's how you pass messages and receive them. That's how, YouTube or Facebook gets to your phone over this big network. Records are being created and kept of all those things. And they go in this bucket, and then people like me, who is not a government employee, gets to search through this and sort through it. And they basically type in whatever they want to search for into this box. It can be an email address. It can be an IP address, the internet address for your computer. It can be a credit card number. It can be a phone number. It can be anything that could appear in web traffic. And then they write just a little justification. It's like a drop-down form that, you're leaving a bad review on, like a restaurant on Yelp. It's the same kind of interface. And you're saying why you're doing this search. And it's supposed to be in accordance with the procedure. But the person who reviews that procedure is your buddy who sits 3 desks down from you, who you eat lunch with every day. And the government says, this is how they protect the system from abuse. There's people double checking this. But the reality is the line between government and corporation has become extraordinarily thin in the modern day. We can zero in on companies that are doing bad things like a Palantir or Booz in this program. And we can and we should resist those excesses and those abuses, those infringements on our interior life and our fundamental rights. But at the same time, we must understand that this is the construction of an industry and a changing of the way that modern societies work, because this has been replicated in other countries, not to the same extent as the United States, but it's becoming increasingly popular. Whereby the only thing that a contractor can't do, the only thing that someone at Booz or something else can't do, is press the red button that fires the missile. They can create the plan. They can choose the target. They can say why they think this person deserves to die, and send that across the desk to the government manager, who says, looks good. And they press the red button for Dell or Booz or Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin or CACI or SAIC or any one of these hundreds and hundreds of companies that you have or have not heard of. And the roster changes every day, but the practice, the relationships, they always stay the same.
Thank you so much for that overview and that explanation. I think that really brings up a lot of the concerns that we've been having watching ICE and how it's conducting its business, right? Because there's both no accountability and no transparency from the companies because they're a private company doing things behind closed doors, but also these policing agencies are not trying to either have any sort of oversight or any sort of making sure that their standards are up to due process standards or whatever standard we would want to hold them to. So maybe to continue that conversation and that thread, Edward, if you can help us make some of those same connections, but with local police departments. We've really seen in the last couple of decades an explosion of police funding and police budgets at a local level. What kind of tech and data tools have you seen local police departments use? And how is that contributing to both, expanding police budgets, but also the violence that Black, Latinx, and immigrant communities face at the hands of police?
Right. I think that, tech here is incredibly, or has been incredibly important in a variety of ways for police departments. First and foremost is that, over the past decade or so, and longer, even more consistent since the post-civil rights era, but, especially in this last decade, there's basis of legitimacy when it comes to the police, who in the wake of riots, in the wake of killings, in the wake of mass profiling, racial profiling, systems being revealed, downs on dissenters and protesters have, and waves of militarization have lost, public support and trust. And there have been attempts by, police departments to try and regain that through a shift towards evidence-based policing, through empirical or scientific or statistical analyses. And one of the ways they've done that is by appealing to the ahistorical and apolitical narratives about technology, which is that it's just a tool or a vessel that can allow us to better understand objective reality. But as Snowden was talking about, these things their choices are how most things are designed, whether it's a bureaucracy or whether it's a technological tool. And there are political choices, social choices, and moral choices that go into how a device is going to be used and deployed, and whose interest it's being used for and deployed for. And, one of the things that's emerged is that in the attempt to regain legitimacy and use tech to regain it, they're trying to present themselves not as a racist, violent, a gratuitously violent, institution that's primarily concerned with protecting property and as a secondary order, maintaining law and order, but instead concerned with objectively fighting crime. But crime is also another category which is politically constructed, right? Crime historically in this country is enforced in ways that are racist and classist and sexist. That specific drugs, are enforced while others aren't. Specific crimes are enforced while others are not. And I think that probably, the easiest example to see this in is with the rise over the past decade of predictive policing, along with facial recognition. The idea there being that we can use technology to, preempt crime or to anticipate criminality. But again, if crime is a historically racist, and sexist and classist construct and category, and if technology is not some apolitical and ahistorical thing, then you're just replicating the same sorts of outcomes. But now you're arguing that it's neutral and objective. And this has grown larger and larger, as police have relied more on these budgets, to hedge the, constant erosion of public support, and also to fight the growing, pressure they may feel internally in the middle of waves of austerity, where we are willing to cut, social programs, but we'll always find money for social control, whether that's in, surveillance programs, whether that's expanding the numbers of police officers in the streets, under the theory that more policing will work, right? Predictive policing and facial recognition specifically, I think, you can look at LAPD, right, where, about in 2008, they had predictive policing or PredPol rolled out or as an experiment by this police chief William Bratton. William Bratton has, someone who was also the commissioner of the New York Police Department in 1994 to 96, and there he introduced ComStat, which is supposed to be this sort of list of methods and tools that allow for objective and empirical analysis, ostensibly. But what they ended up doing was contributing to massive based systems, racial profiling regimes, most notably stop and frisk, which still has lingering negative effects on, Black and brown communities where it was targeted, where most of the people who were being stopped and frisked or then being exposed to more police brutality afterwards in that, unlawful detainment is, they're Black, they're brown, they're, young, and they're ostensibly being held up because they were being suspicious. But in reality, they were just being held up because of race, right? And, with these, these algorithms and with these, tech tools, you're seeing a replication of that. Predpol operates on the assumption that we can look based on historical crime data to build a sort of box where crime is going to happen, right? But if historical crime data is, biased in of itself, then you're just replicating where, crime has been noticed because police are disproportionately sent there. And then when you get there, anyone who's in that spot or anyone who goes into that spot is automatically a suspect. And that becomes reasonable cause or a reasonable standard to stop someone, exposing people to more police violence brutality. This algorithmic or predictive logic has spread throughout the way that police are engaging with the public and the way that they deploy these tools. And also at fault are the tech companies, because tech companies do understand that there's no way, to actually construct these tools and use them for these purposes without replicating those biases, right? You have Amazon enthusiastically selling a Ring surveillance system to over 1,000 police departments. You have Amazon also working with ICE as the backbone for ICE and hosting their data. You have Amazon selling its own facial recognition technology. You have the same with Palantir. Palantir offering its services to government agencies and to corporations who are interested in enacting that sort of surveillance. And when you step back, these companies are making a conscious decision and choice, sure, to engage in and use a tool or product to surveil people that is usually used in racist ends. For immoral outcomes, but it's also part of a larger decision and set of political choices by the system that choose to deprioritize anything but these contracts, which are also becoming even more important for these agencies, especially for the police departments, because they use the stops, the checkpoints, the fines as a way to extract even more money, to fund their own operations. Police departments can seize property and sell that for more facilities and more tools. They use their fines also for the same purposes. They can use technology to, create smart, ankle bracelets that, you end up having to pay for yourself and have to deal with even more strict fines if you violate some, rules of parole or rules that are set forth for you while you're having that bracelet on. And I think that when, as you go through the list, you see that, tech and police departments have worked with each other closely, partly because, tech needs, needs governments, needs police departments to provide that veneer of legitimacy to itself and to, obscure racist origins, whether it be in, the 1890 census where computing technology was originally used to just justify or, explain why, Black and brown people were in jail more than other groups, ignoring and flattening structural reasons, racist reasons, classist reasons why these outcomes happen. Tech and the police have, for the entirety of their histories, been searching for narratives. And I think with this pandemic, tech has found its one where it's now put itself forward as necessary to help contain COVID, but also to help keep the economy churning along. And police departments are trying to, keep control and ostensibly cap civil unrest by enacting mass surveillance on protesters, on people who are talking about protests in social media, which are tactics that they did during Occupy, tactics that they did during the Iraq War protests, tactics that they've historically always done, but just find new legitimation narratives, every single time. So I think that it's important to, recognize that the problems that we have now are consistent. They're a consequence of the system that we have, which has chosen to pour more and more and more money into anything but, helping communities thrive and their health and well-being, but instead controlling them and surveilling them and putting them in prison and punishing them for the crime of being Black or brown, or poor.
No, and thank you so much for making all of those points, because I think it's been really important for, especially in this political moment, to understand how these companies are also marketing their tools as a way of fighting against, what we've seen organizers ask for on the streets, which is defunding the police, right? And so we see these conversations being in direct relationship with each other, but we can't lose sight of the fact that policing, as you're saying, is so racialized, is so based on class, is so based on gender discrimination, and we have to understand those things as folks are also organizing against them. So to actually address some of these issues around retaliation and what's been happening, particularly criminalizing Black dissent, it is a great honor to be able to bring in someone who's going to, from a guest who's going to be asking a question as well. So with that, I want to introduce Maisha Hayes from Media Justice to ask the question of one of our panelists. So welcome, Maisha. Thank you so much for making it out here with us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maisha Hayes, and I am the campaign director at Media Justice. We are a national organization based in Oakland, California, and our mission is to fight for the communication and digital rights of communities of color. Thank you so much for having me in this conversation today. I'm super honored to be here. Media Justice is leading a campaign called Protect Black Dissent, because our communities know that the FBI has a long history of surveilling and undermining Black-led movements for radical change and social justice. And at this time, we know that that history of politicized surveillance continues to this day. After the Ferguson uprising, we saw the FBI create terms like Black identity extremist to justify surveillance and the criminalization of Black activists. During the recent uprisings, we have seen local police use Border Patrol drones and Stingray phone trackers. And there are also rumors that federal agencies are doing contract tracing, but we're not sure how. From your understanding of how things work, what are the new threats against community organizers, and how can we protect ourselves? When you see what new things companies and governments are doing, what are the most imminent threats that keep you up at night?
Yeah, when I think about this, this is a common question that I get, and it's always difficult to answer, because what we are seeing really is a technological arms race between the richest companies in the world, the most powerful governments in the history of the species, and then a lot of people in economically precarious, politically disenfranchised, and otherwise disadvantaged positions who are seeking to effect change on a local level. And on the one hand, you have governments that have, the NSA, which has 30,000 people who are just on its own internal classified network, who are able to go in every day, 9 to 5, and with all their different missions, watch the whole world to the best of what their technological capability happens to be that week, and every week it gets better. But that doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. That doesn't mean we can give up. I think what I always advise people to do is to try to understand technology that you're using, at least generally. It's not fair to ask community organizers and activists to be able to fight off the NSA, the Mossad, If you're in Russia, the FSB. If you're in China, the MSS. Every country of any serious geopolitical weight today has an internal security service. And we don't like to think about this in these terms in the United States. It's not polite to describe the FBI as an internal security service. We think about them, we're shown them on TV and in movies as the good guys, who are saving us from terrorists, criminals, mobsters, whatever. Again, the light holding back the darkness is very clear, black and white world of good guys and bad guys. But you have to remember that it's that same FBI that Alvaro M. Bedoya, professor, I believe, at Georgetown, declared Martin Luther King Jr. The greatest national security threat in the United States 2 days after he gave the I Have a Dream speech. You have to understand that in places, in agencies and governments where, again, they see themselves as the shield against change, because instability is the enemy, instability is the bad thing, progress looks like a threat. And so when you start to understand that you will always be the enemy to them, even if what you're doing is absolutely right, even if you are the most peaceful, even if you keep your nose clean, even if you are the perfect angel that they always deny that any activist is when they run up against law enforcement, because in reality, everyone's life is complicated and we all have to make hard choices. We need to understand how it is that we are targeted, at least generally. The technologies will change. The programs that you use for safe communication, which right now you could download, for example, the Tor browser, Tor. This allows you to browse more anonymously on the internet. You could use Signal, which is an encrypted messaging application. It's free, it's not corporate. These things are great for the moment, but they don't protect you. They're not an invisibility cloak it's not a get out of jail free card. What it does is it reduces your window of vulnerability. It reduces what can be easily and cheaply known about you. And you have to remember that even the NSA, even the FBI, whoever you're afraid of, they have a budget too. They have a limited number of people, even if it's an extraordinary number of people. There are so many hours they can work. There are so many things they can look at, and they want to go home and watch their shows too. The harder you make their work, the more free you make your society. And I see that, people get nervous about this. They think it sounds radical. They think it sounds like pro-terrorist or whatever. But you have to understand that in the United States, if you believe the lofty rhetoric that we put in founding documents, right, which we all know are not so perfect, but if we believe the things that we were taught is the way America is supposed to be, the work of law enforcement is supposed to be hard. It is supposed to be difficult. The extraordinary powers that they are granted are supposed to be used as a last resort when there's a real public safety imperative in play here. And their actions, whatever they may be, despite the gravity of the threat, are supposed to be limited to what is necessary and proportionate to the threat faced, the threat presented. Now, when is the last time, you went on Twitter and looked at the police videos of the day and went, oh, yes, that's necessary and proportionate to the threat of protesters, people marching. And then we talk about just organizers, right? People who are trying to make a change. And this is at the planning stage. Well, this gets back to understanding a fundamental truth of the world. Intelligence agencies use the same kind of language that law enforcement agencies do. They say, we're here to keep you safe. To all the senators, all the congressmen, all the media, they can go out on 60 Minutes anytime they want, and they can command the broadcast attention of the world. But surveillance is not about public safety, and this was very well established in the documents in 2013 for anyone who wants to look at them. Mass surveillance, particularly, which is what's being used against people like protesters and used to identify people like community organizers. Surveillance is about power. It's about control. If you look at the documents, if you look at how these things are used, if you look at how they're targeted, it's about economic espionage, it's about diplomatic control, it's about social influence, and it's about enforcing systemic stability. But stability means the end of progress, right? As Naomi mentioned before, there will always be crises, there will always be disasters that occur, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's an earthquake, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's a human disaster, whether it's a war, whether it's a politically intended act of subversion that upsets our world, there will be a level of instability that's thrust upon us. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, who is benefiting from this, and how are things being restabilized in the wake of this? When 9/11 happened, of course, we had a lot of restrictions on what the intelligence community could and could not do. There were strict limits on the collection and interception of communications that were in the United States, even not about Americans, even not between Americans, but that were simply collected here. But why was that? That was because the intelligence community so grossly abused their powers in the previous civil rights movement. And so restrictions were imposed on them, but then they go, oh, hey, terrorism, everything's different, everything's changed if you don't give us carte blanche, if you don't let us do whatever we want. You're going to die, your children's going to die, the oceans are going to boil off, the atmosphere is going to catch fire. And that works. Because when people are fearful, they're very easy to persuade. We see it happening now with the pandemic situation. We see it happening now with media representations of the protest situation, where not just some channels, but actually many of them play up property crimes. They play up the scariness, the sporadic violence that happens in any protest, no matter how well behaved, because there's always going to be some level of knucklehead in any group of human population. And just I know I've sort of gone off on like way out in the woods here, but I want to bring it back. Association. The right to associate freely, the right to speak freely. All of these things are basic fundamental rights that are supposed to be guaranteed to everyone, and for good reason. All of them are supposed to spring from sort of a mother right, which is privacy, right? Because if you think about it, freedom of speech doesn't mean anything if you can't figure out for yourself something new to say. If you're afraid of being, hounded out for whatever it is, just when you think about it, you're on the wrong side of the issue. Freedom of religion doesn't mean anything if you can't decide for yourself what it is that you truly believe rather than the beliefs that you inherited from the other. Everything, when you go into the language of private property, having something for yourself, rather than society owning you and everything with you, all of your thoughts, all of your works, to the jury right, which is recognizing that you have an interest to yourself, to your freedom, to your person, that must be overcome by society in order to act against you. All of these things recognize that there are lines around a person that must be respected to produce liberty, which is this general principle that we should be able to do what we want. We should be able to believe what we want. We should be able to advocate for what we want, so long as we're not hurting anyone. Well, that's no longer respected. It's not respected by businesses, but because it's not unlawful for businesses to do this. All of those rights, all of those wonderful guarantees that we hear, even if you believe that they're respected by the government, those rights only bind the government, the federal government, in many cases, the state governments. But Google, Facebook, AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, none of these guys are bound in the slightest way by this. They don't care about these things. And so when you talk about organizing, how are you organizing? How are you identifying your peers? How are you staying in contact with them? How are you moving? How are you traveling? The reality is today, we are buying devices, these smartphones, because they are a necessity, and they are increasingly more necessary for people the lower on the economic totem pole they are, because this is your entryway to the economy. This is how you apply for jobs. This is how you apply for an apartment. This is how you pay rent. This is how you set up your bank account. This is how you buy food. Everything that you do is intermediated by a screen that the very first time you turned it on presented you with a prompt that said, here's 200 pages of legalese, and if you don't click OK, you can't use this device that you just paid X number of hundred of dollars for. And this gets back to the fundamental stakes of inequality, right? The reality is we are all being forced to abide by rules that we did not choose for ourselves, whether we were born into them, whether they were voted upon us, in many cases in questionable circumstances. But now they rule our lives. And society has developed in such a way that we have very little ability to change them in structural, systemic ways. And it is only when we have the grossest of abuses, George Floyd, and 1 million, 10 million, 100 million people who are willing to actually not just believe it is wrong, but to stand up and show that it is wrong, to go out bodily and act against this, that we are able to change things in at least a beginning way. But back to the central question, which was just, what do we do? Recognize that those devices, those phones, you pay for, but you do not own. Their software can and is updated. It's updated remotely. It's done all the times. And in most cases, this is a good thing. If you don't update your phone, believe me, guys, I know a little bit about this. It's vulnerable just to simple malware out there. It's a very dangerous thing. But at the same time, you have to recognize that when you look at the phone and it appears, the screen's off, it's just sitting on the desk, it's not doing anything, it is on. It is active. It is communicating to 100 different parties about where it is, about what you're doing, about what your activities are. It's polling Gmail servers to check for email updates. It's polling weather servers to say what this is, but it's reporting your location to the server to say this, that, or the other. It's uploading your contact to Facebook, even when you're not installing an app that is for Facebook, but simply because the developers of Facebook went, we can design what's called an SDK, a software development kit. This little shim of software packages that makes life easier for programmers that live in Paris, Bratislava, Albuquerque, wherever, and they give it away for free. And they go, if you bake this into your software that is not Facebook, we'll give you all these nice things for free. We'll give you analytics for free about what kind of phones are being used, how many people have installed, all this great stuff. These people are like, hey, wonderful. Those people aren't privacy experts. It's unfair to expect that they're privacy experts. But what that Facebook shim is also doing is every time someone installs this thing, it's reporting back to the mothership. It's reporting back to Mark Zuckerberg, the whole human population that's using this app, information to them as well. And there are very few legal constraints on how that's used. The United States is one of the only developed countries in the world that does not have a basic privacy law. In Europe, where they have what's called the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, this thing is supposed to be, the big scary law all the corporations are afraid of. If you don't abide by it, there's 4% of global revenue fines, which for Facebook is, an insane amount of money. And yet we know Facebook has been violating it. We know Google has been violating it. We know they're violating it right now. And they would be facing the greatest fines in the history of, corporatocracy anywhere. But now, years later, many court cases later, these fines have yet to be applied once. And so you have to recognize the law is not going to save you. The law might make work harder for the government. It might make the police check 3 more boxes. It might make someone who looks like me sitting at the NSA in Hawaii, who doesn't know about your protests, who has no skin in the game, who doesn't care, who's going to the beach afterwards. And they are looking at these things. They are looking at the network. They're looking at the contacts between phones, who you called, how long you're on the phone for. And they're deriving insights from that, even if you are using an encrypted messenger, because what they're trying to create is what they call the social graph, right? The connections between people, the connections between devices that really represent who matters to us the most, who we love the most, where we go the most. As long as your phone is with you, and as long as your phone is on, and as long as you're paying for it with a card to a company that's associated with your name, that's associated with your billing address, right? this tracks you around. And some people go out there and they give themselves a false sense of safety because they go, well, I bought a track phone at Walmart. I bought it in cash. You know, it's not in my name. It's not connected to my network. I'm okay. Then they keep it next to their phone. You know, one's in pocket A, one's in purse B, and they drive back home and they stay there overnight. And they go to the protest the next day, and then they go to the convention the next day. And these phones are moving in tandem, right? Well, remember, there's a map of all of your phone's movements. That's the nature of how the network works. Think about when you dial a phone number, how does only that phone ring out of all the phones in the world? Well, the phone network has to have some general idea of what cell phone tower somewhere in the world any given phone handset is connected with at any given time. That means that record exists somewhere. And it could be deleted after you move away from that tower. And it should be deleted after you move away from that tower because it's no longer useful. But it is not. When we look at agencies like the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, in the United States, and their cooperation with a company called AT&T, one of the largest phone providers in the United States, we found that they were keeping records about their customers, your calling records. Everyone you had ever called, every pizza shop, every grandmother, every boyfriend, every girlfriend, wife, husband, you know, son, daughter, mother, father, going back to 1987. There are people listening to this live stream right now where if you're an AT&T customer, they have every call you've ever made and they keep it just because they can sell it to an agency like the DEA as a service. And they do this without a warrant, but a lower standard of legal paperwork called a subpoena. And that's just, you know, who you're calling, not what you said on the call and things like that. The last thing, and then I'll shut up because I know this has gone long, is your movements, right? Because I talked about that. And people think, oh, well, I'll turn off location on my phone, right? All that does is it stops giving the phone's sense of its location to applications, right? It's saying, I'm not going to tell Google Maps where I am right now. I'm not going to tell my weather app where I am right now. But the phone always knows where it is as long as it's connected to the cell phone network. And that means the cell phone network always knows where the phone is as long as it's turned on. You know, there are ways you can do this in airplane mode, remove battery. But the whole thing is to understand that phones are fundamentally tracking devices. They must be in order to provide all the communications capabilities that we expect today in the modern framework. They don't have to remain that way. We could demand that network be changed, be re-architected. But as it is today, we're using standards that were decided and determined in the 1970s, the 1980s, that give companies and governments all this power, and they're very reluctant to let that go. AT&T is keeping those records, what's called cell site location information, where your phone has gone, regardless of what the location setting on your phone is, or regardless of what Google Apple knows. Going back to 2007 or 2008, I think. So remember that even the phone that you lost years ago, the phone company still knows where that went at the lowest moment in your life.
Thank you both for that question and for that really thoughtful answer, Ed. I think, you know, one of the things that for us has been really important to kind of clarify as a campaign is precisely that there's no one trick or one way of being able to keep yourself safe in all of this. It's actually about building our movement's collective analysis of what's happening to know how to respond to power. Because if we keep playing the game on their rules and with their apps, you know, we're very clear on where that's going to leave us. And so it is actually a question of how do we analyze what we're seeing at a broader scale to come up with the strongest possible demands that will actually help shift and break open the system. Because as of right now, if we're just asking for encryption or just asking for a little bit less surveillance or a different type of phone, that's not really going to cut it, right? And so we do have to do the deep level analysis to be able to make the broad and bold demands that we need in this moment. So
that's precisely right. And if I could say just one last thing on that, because it's so important, is, you know, the fundamental question that she asked, which, you know, is difficult to get to because it's such a big and important one, is, what the community activists do to change this, to stop, to be safe. And the reality is technology can help. Technology can reduce, again, armor your communications, make the FBI, make the NSA, make whoever spend a few more hours to do this, a few more weeks to do this. Or maybe they can't get you entirely. They have to shift to someone else in your network, someone else in your movement, right? But the reality is, don't think you can be, the magic cell phone ninja that is just unbreakable, because even if you are, you're alone, because you can't expect everyone else to operate exactly as you can. You can't expect everyone else to never make a mistake, because people are human. They fall into emergencies. They have to cut corners. They have to do that. If you want to change things, if you want to make protesting safe, if you want to make activism safe, the way to do that is to make the country safe. The only way that things get better, the only way we can protect anyone is by protecting everyone. And the way you do that as community activists is not to stop. You get your neighbor to come out with you and say, you're going to have to arrest all of us.
No, that's exactly right. I think we actually have to build broader movements so that if you are able to target one or two people, you're not going to have the whole movement fall down, but actually it's going to replicate and have that be a radicalizing experience that can actually strengthen movement. Because I think the other thing that sometimes gets lost in all these conversations around surveillance is that we forget that usually when movements do have these things happen, it's actually in-person surveillance. It's actually, police officers coming into our circles, having conversations with us. And so it's actually how we build deep and radical relationships with each other that will let us have a movement that can be safer for all of us. But kind of thinking through some of these movement demands that we have in this moment, a lot of us have been really pushing behind the demand to defund the police. But we know that when we get down to it and start to get into the nitty gritty, there's a bunch of different roadblocks that both police departments, but also local cities will try to put in the way to make sure that this doesn't actually happen, even though folks are pushing for it. So I want to invite another guest presenter to ask a question precisely about this issue. It's a great honor to be able to invite Claudia Munoz, who is co-interim director at Grassroots Leadership in Austin, Texas, to ask Edward a question as well. So Claudia, welcome, and looking forward to hearing your question.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. So here in Austin, we found that at least 44% of approved police department contract money is for tech and surveillance. And these contracts both increase our policing budgets and create data and information pipelines to ICE and other federal enforcement agencies. So when calls to the funds, and please, is there an opportunity here to the role companies and federal authorities have had in perpetually expanding surveillance, and how do we make sure that local lawmakers don't see tech as race neutral or as an alternative to incarceration?
Right. No, I think those are great questions. That example of having 44% of the budget be allocated to tech and surveillance is, a good one, because so much of the budgets of most cities is going already to police departments. And so that the fight ends up becoming how do you reallocate the fact that the city, starved for funds as it is already, either because it's cut its own taxation, or because it's cut, other revenue generating mechanisms. How do you make sure that when you're cutting the contracts, that they don't try to come up with another way to extract that money from the community? And I think the first step is a sort of like no quarter for any of these sort of things. I think that when it comes to the tech contracts, they're self-perpetuating and they're self-justifying. Predictive policing justifies more predictive policing and justifies more contracts to then catch potential criminals. Facial recognition demands all sorts of funds and allocation of resources to it. It ends up building an infrastructure that we need to if we're going to defund the police, if we're going to abolish the police or seriously consider the abolition of the police, of prisons, of, the ecosystem of institutions that are concerned with punishing people, with throwing people in cages, with, separating people from communities, with, viewing justice as harm instead of, restoration, then we're going to need to dismantle these infrastructures. And one way is simply to, blocking that tech from ever going to these, places in the first place. Over 1,600 employees at Google just, made a petition to say that we do not want you to sell our products to police departments. They cited as an example, Clarkstown Police Department, which is being sued right now for surveilling Black Lives Matter activists. They also cited the fact that its venture capital arm is funding, military and police surveillance operations that are being used to, track down migrants, to track down or preempt, and predict crime. And I think that stopping the contracts is one step, but also there needs to be a sort of return to this, to Ludism. Like the Luddites are considered or slandered as like people who just kind of mindlessly broke machines, but the intention there was they were destroying devices, right, that are specifically threatening their lives and their livelihood, and it's not clear to me why we should allow devices to exist if they're so clearly anti-human and if they're so clearly immoral. Why should technology exist if its stated purpose is to throw people in cages, to track them down and treat them like animals, to throw them out of the country, to terrorize their communities, to surveil them consistently? There's no reason that should exist if we are, concerned, as these institutions say they are, with, public safety and law and order, or whatever. As Snowden laid out, surveillance is about power. It's about social control. It's about maintaining a certain, dynamic and degree of domination over a population. And these sorts of things have to go. Some people I think would advocate instead the Ludism needs to be with advocacy and legal domains and legislative approaches. But I think that if that doesn't work, then that doesn't work. And there are all sorts of militant approaches that can be taken that have been successful across the country. Stop LAPD spying does simply very theatrical interventions, but also very concentrated militant interventions into surveillance, into unveiling police budgets, into FOIA requests, into radicalizing people and bringing people into a broader and broader coalition to oppose it. The work with Mihente, with bringing light onto Palantir's, surveillance networks and the analysis that it does and the ways in which it's used to terrorize and prey on the people. That sort of work has, as much as sanitized, radicalized people, realizing that this sort of stuff is happening every single day and being supported by some of the largest companies in the world, and companies that know that what's going on is indefensible. So I think that, there's going to have to be, a bunch of approaches, because we cannot defund the police if we are going to have this surveillance infrastructure, around us, and this punitive infrastructure. But that also is a consequence of the environment that we're in right now, where there's a desert when it comes to public funding, right? And when everything has been privatized or digitized, which is just privatization by a digital company, the holes that are plugged are by these companies instead of by public budgets or by public goods and services. It's not. The reason why, for example, Uber is so widely successful in terms of filling in the gaps left behind by public transportation are the same reasons why these tech companies are still able to come in and make contracts with city governments to, in theory, offload some of the burden of policing, but in reality just allocate more resources to themselves and direct more violence into the streets, into the general public. And we're going to need to be militant with the industry, with its, the funding that is going into this, with the funding models that, structure the industrial model of Silicon Valley, of the private sector more generally, and, part of that is also unmaking, things like, technologies that exist now. I think there's a tendency to view institutions or relations or traditions as being permanent because they exist. But, every form of technology that exists would not exist in an ideal world. The world we want is not a world where we need a phone that operates in a way which specifically tracks you every single place you go, and which shares your data in specific ways and transactional ways that, allow companies to then exploit it, gain more insight into you, manipulate your behavior, and in one way or another try to make a profit off of you. There are all sorts of ways in our daily lives in which the design of the world is not one that lines up with what we would envision if we were making a world that was moral, if we were making a world concerned with the safety of communities or the justice that people would want if they're, if a harm comes to them. And all these struggles, I think, are connected. So when it comes to the police, we're going to have to really, ask if the companies that are supporting them have any business continuing to exist, and what that looks like if it means that we decide that they don't need to exist. Because I think, again, these are like some of the largest corporations. You can't snap your fingers and get rid of them, but militant activism can and has gotten rid of these sorts of companies. Again, with I use Uber as an example because it's like my white whale, but Uber is tens of billions of dollars in valuation. Militant activism among its drivers, who are some of the most exploited workers in the industry, who are not able to get minimum wages, who are not able to get health insurance, who are not able to get any sort of benefits that regular employees get. They've been able to bring this company almost to its knees. And I think that sort of activism, that sort of those sort of interventions can be an inspiration for other fields and for other companies and for other fronts and battles that we need to fight, because a lot of these companies they are consciously exploiting and profiting from suffering and from violence. And if that's going to be, that's a decision they've made. And, I think that decision invalidates their right to exist, to help us design a social order, or to help us design the technologies that we would want to persist in this world. And I think this moment with defunding the police is just like a perfect way to kind of unfurl that. If your police department chooses to, allocate its resources into surveillance and the murder of unarmed people, then that's a moral failing. And if there are companies behind that, police department that are also involved in giving them the cameras to, find suspects that they then end up killing, or giving them algorithms to go into places where they end up killing people, then that's also a moral, bankruptcy there. And neither of them should exist.
Well, thank you both so much for that question and that answer. I think a lot of organizers in this moment have had to deal with that difficult moment of both having to, use the energy to continue to have more people talk about defunding the police, use it as a way of dismantling the last 400 and 500 years of, horrible things that they've been doing to communities, but also have to know how these both police departments, but also now their new allies in tech, are going to use this moment to remarket their same ways of operating, use it as ways of positioning things as either race neutral options or ways of improving policing. And so, we also just want to take the opportunity to make the invitation that if there are other local organizers or local organizations that are doing this work around defunding the police and want particular assistance of analyzing your local budget to find those tech and surveillance contracts, to be able to have the line items to then go back and say, this is the first place where we can cut, this is the first place where we can take away resources, please reach out. The email address is here on the screen. Y'all can hit us up on social media. But really, we want to sort of use our resources and our research capabilities to be able to support these fights. So for folks that want to continue to do work like the amazing stuff that is happening in Austin, Texas around defunding the police with grassroots leadership, please reach out, and just want to make that invitation to everyone who's watching. And to kind of continue this thread of the politics of how we shift the conversation around surveillance, Naomi, I had a question for you just around how this plays out at the federal level in terms of politics and upcoming elections. When Donald Trump was pushing to have a brick and mortar border wall to keep immigrants out, Democrats not only said, no, we shouldn't have a wall, they said, we shouldn't have that type of wall. We need a smart wall full of surveillance, and that's actually going to be more effective policy, right? And so what we see time and time again is actually Democrats are pushing for surveillance, are becoming more and more dependent on money from tech. And that's really impeding having a real dialogue around how these things are used in our society. How do you see the issue of surveillance playing out in the 2020 presidential election, and how do you see surveillance with Democrats broadly?
Sure, yeah. I was just remembering that at the end of 2019, Barack Obama came up with a list of book recommendations, his favorite books of 2019. And the number one book that he recommended was Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which is funny because maybe not so funny to Edward Snowden. But there's a graphic maybe that we can pull up that was put together by the San Francisco Chronicle that shows the exodus from the Obama administration directly to Silicon Valley, and the building of the infrastructure that Shoshana Zuboff describes. And indeed, it predates the end of the Obama administration. Obama hired senior executives from Google into his administration. And then, his campaign manager, David Plouffe, went to Uber. We've heard recently quite a bit from Jay Carney, his former spokesperson, who is now the chief hack over at Amazon, and on and on and on. I mean, look at the graphic. I'm not going to go through it, but what can I say? I busted my ass for Bernie. We lost, and now we have Biden. And look at that graph. So it's not going to be coming from the leadership of the Democratic Party. It absolutely matters that we have insurgent candidacies. When somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wins and puts, abolish ICE on the political agenda, that matters, right? And here's hoping that it's a good day for Jamal Bowman and Charles Booker in Kentucky, and that we, enlarge the squad. And I think that there is something promising, and I think honestly, it's all that we can hope for at this point is in the interplay between these kind of insurgent politicians who make it through, who are movement connected, right? I think that really matters, and accountable and held accountable to movements. And mass organizing from below, putting pressure on the Democratic Party during the campaign, as the uprising is right now. I mean, it is changing the political debate. Not enough at the heights of the Democratic Party, but we are seeing some movement. And we are seeing movement in tech companies, not out of the goodness of the hearts of these tech companies, but because of the kind of dogged organizing that Edward was talking about within these companies, right? Workers within these companies are a player, right? So we've got social movements, we've got workers inside the companies, we've got insurgent candidates that sometimes win, and I think that's what we've got, right? Because Biden is, in all likelihood, going to be the candidate running against Donald Trump. I personally think it really matters that Donald Trump lose the election. I think a second term of Trump is not just an extension of the first term of Trump. I often tell people, look at Modi. Look, this is a global phenomenon that we're talking about here. Look at what Modi did when he had the seeming, stamp of approval of a second electoral mandate. He immediately turns the lights off on Kashmir, cuts the internet off completely, right? And moves to strip citizenship of millions upon millions of Muslims in India. Indian citizens. So I don't think it is a seamless, when you're dealing with these wannabe authoritarian figures, I don't think it is a seamless continuation. So I do think it matters that Trump not get a second term. But we have our work cut out for us with the Democratic Party, who, whether it's Nancy Pelosi or Schumer, or Biden, once again, look at that graph. It's also reflected in campaign contributions. One thing that I think is interesting and worth remembering is that we were making progress before the pandemic when it came to questioning some of these basic principles. If you think even about the way the media received Edward Snowden's book, right? It was very different. People wanted to listen. The very fact that Obama felt he needed to list Shoshana Zuboff's book as his #1 pick reflects the kind of organizing that Mijente was involved in keeping Amazon out of New York City for its second headquarters. I in the piece I wrote about the screen, what I called the Screen New Deal, I quoted Eric Schmidt in an unguarded moment in the early days of the pandemic, talking about how people who had been critical of companies like Amazon and Google now see that they are the only reason why, we're getting our packages delivered, we're getting the food that we need, our kids are, learning remotely, we're able to have telehealth. And he was in this unguarded moment, he was very clear that he saw the pandemic as a marketing opportunity in the face of this problem, in the face of the fact that there were candidates running, to lead the Democratic Party who were talking about breaking up big tech, who were questioning the basic principles of surveillance capitalism and this hoovering of all of our data. I don't think that the conversation in those primaries was expansive enough. I don't think our problems are solved by breaking up these companies. I think we need to be talking, as Edward Snowden has talked about why you're holding on to the data in the first place, right? And yet I think that this is a moment because of this huge racial justice uprising, the fact that because we are talking about the abuse of these technologies, and personally I think they're abusive across the board. I don't think it's healthy at all for us to be tracked in this way. I don't think our lives should be legible in this way. I think we have a right to lead illegible lives, right? And we need to put that back on the agenda. And I think the marketing opportunity presented by the pandemic to companies like Amazon and Google hasn't gone the way that they had thought it was in the early days, right? The racial justice uprisings are part of that. But there's another part of it, Ed, you said earlier, everything you do is intermediated by a screen. And that's almost true, but it's not completely true. There are still things that we do that don't have screens involved. We don't have to bring our phones with us everywhere. Some of us don't always, but there are physical spaces, or there were more physical spaces where we would get together and have conversations that were not on platforms, right? And, some of those places were classrooms, conversations that would take place in public universities behind closed doors were not being tracked. Things that went on in K-12 as well. Conversations with your doctor, not all of it was tracked. And I think one of the things that's really been scary about this pandemic is that those few spaces left are disappearing, right? Ed talked about the sort of backdoor privatization involved in digitization, right? We're seeing public schools handed over to private platforms, whether it's Zoom or Google. I teach at a public university, but we're not, probably not going back to that physical space anymore, and we're going to be teaching on platforms. My son, same thing, right? And we're seeing similar things happen with public healthcare systems, with telehealth. The reason why I don't feel totally hopeless about it, and I know we're sort of running out of time, is that people have not enjoyed this. There has been an acceleration of the timetable because of the pandemic with this, with the so-called social distancing period, right? Where a lot of what would have happened more slowly in terms of having every single one of our interactions happening on a platform, whether it's conversations like this, whether it's Zoom hangouts with friends, whether it's our kids learning on Google Classrooms, it all leapt when it was going to walk, right? And because it leapt, I think a lot more of us are conscious of the fact that it fucking sucks. We are not enjoying this. This is not a healthy way to live. There are huge benefits to community organizing, in the speed with which we can get people into a place because of these technologies, but there are also huge drawbacks in the fact that we can be turned off. This is why we have to look at other countries where governments have just turned off the internet or turned off particularly effective social media platforms when they were getting too effective, right? So we need to build in, I think it's really, really important that we build in redundancies for our movements, that we can never be in a situation where Mark Zuckerberg is we have to go through Mark Zuckerberg to access our own movement. And we don't know how to find each other without him, or without Jack Dorsey. We can't trust any of these guys. That doesn't mean we don't use these tools, which I think have been effective, but there's a difference between using these tools and being completely dependent on them and not building in those redundancies, right? One of the things that I think we're experiencing with all of these crises overlapping, right? Whether it is our healthcare systems buckling under the weight of this pandemic, or the climate crisis, what capitalism does is it, in the name of efficiency, it removes so-called redundancies, right? And it streamlines everything. But nature has redundancies built into it because actually redundancies are healthy. And redundancies allow us to absorb shocks, right? And movements are going to face those shocks. So I think that's just something for us to think about, is we need to use these technologies because they do help us. But we also can never be in a situation where we can't organize without them, where we can't find our people without them. And we also have to fight for these core principles, right? That we cannot allow this to be the final stage of capitalist enclosure, which begins with the enclosure of land and labor. It continues into the neoliberal era, where the public sphere, the state is privatized by corporations, and is now entering into our most intimate interrelations, right? Where every single conversation, every emotion is tracked, digitized, stored, bundled, sold back to us. And like I said, I take some solace in the fact that almost everybody who I speak to about how they have experienced, or how we have experienced, this radical increase in having our lives mediated, every aspect of our lives mediated by screens, are not enjoying it at all. And I think that creates an organizing space for us to broaden out.
And it's really interesting to hear you have some of these reflections about how movements and, use online spaces to have conversations with each other. Because I do think, I remember very clearly, after Obama's first campaign for presidency, there was this idea or this excitement of using social media, using these types of networking tools to be able to win elections, right? And forward a couple of years after looking at Cambridge Analytica, understanding how Trump did, basically very similar things, I think we're starting to understand how surveillance, how policing, and access to democracy are all really kind of connected in ways that are really deep, and that our movements can't lose sight of. Because if we just are counting our wins in terms of Facebook shares, or counting our wins in terms of how many people we're able to reach on these platforms, in a lot of ways we are doing ourselves a disservice of not being able to make accurate assessments of power, right? That then let us actually push on a couple of different levels, whether it's to defund the police, to abolish ICE, or to actually bring about ways of organizing against the surveillance machinery. Um, and maybe just to close this out and to be talking about how movements build power, I want to ask you this last question, Ed, around tech worker organizing, right? A couple of folks on the panel so far have mentioned it. We've seen some exciting moments where tech workers have been able to come together to push back against their companies. And you yourself as a whistleblower took tremendous personal risk, right? And have been aggressively and viciously persecuted by the government. You know, as much as we're both excited by a lot of tech worker organizing that we've seen, we've also been very disillusioned with, you know, big tech companies like Booz Allen, like Amazon, kind of make comments or make public statements about being in solidarity with Black Lives Matter movements, for example. Or we've seen, you know, tech workers organize a sign-on letter, take a stand, but not actually use their power to stop very, very dangerous technologies from coming out, even when they're directly confronted by directly impacted communities about these harms. So what do you think has to happen to have there be more whistleblowers, more organizing, and folks within the tech sector actually take a stand with movements and participate in this dismantling? You know, and what maybe advice you would have for a younger Edward Snowden as you're taking on, you know, this journey and all of this out. Just lessons learned that might be helping us all and as we figure out how to get the next whistleblowers to come forward.
It's a great question. It's a really difficult one. If I were going to, you know, advise my younger self, I mean, everybody on the call, everybody in the audience who's listening to this, I mean, you remember what I said earlier. I'm listing this whole thing where I'm like signing up to work all these jobs at the NSA, to the CIA. I volunteered for the U.S. Army at the same time everyone else was protesting against the war in Iraq. And the reason I did that was because I believed what was on TV. I believed what the president was saying. You know, I drank the Kool-Aid. I came from a federal family. I was taught that the government was fundamentally good. And I still believe that the government can be fundamentally good. But I have realized through my experience and through discoveries of the fact that the private truths known to and held by governments are often very different. And in fact, we're completely the opposite of their public statements and public promises, their claims of a duty, a sense of obligation to the public, what those happen to be. That tension there is the teachable lesson. I should have paid more attention. I didn't, because I simply had faith. I was privileged. I wasn't impacted by any of these policies. Most of my political understanding came from, you know, Hollywood movies and culture. And the reality is, if you're always portrayed as the good guys, you begin to believe that you are the good guy, particularly when you start to associate with them, particularly when you get, you know, secret handshakes and top secret clearances and polygraphs and all the fun accoutrements of being, you know, on the inside. And I was sheltered from the kind of hard political thinking because of the fact that I worked in technology. And this is what's happening in Facebook today. This is what's happening in Google today and Microsoft today, at Amazon today, is we begin to see the same kind of awakenings that I went through as a young man beginning to be replicated in a new generation of young people. Because the reality is all work is political work. I don't care if you're selling hot dogs on the street. We're all confronted with choices about how our labor is used, how we direct that, who we are really serving, who we're working for, and who benefits from the labor of our lives. Technologists like to believe that technology is value neutral. Engineers, they like to believe that they're like scientists. What they do is something that's pure, and they're just trying to get the rocket up. Where the rocket comes down is not their department. That's somebody else's problem. In the last century, we had the same problem where a generation of physicists harnessed the power of the atom, exciting new technology. They thought they were building clean energy. You know, they thought they were realizing the future. And then all their hard work became one of the most atrocious weapons in the history of humanity, maybe second only to biological weapons. And this is what we're seeing today. We're seeing the atomic moment for technology. We're seeing people who made, Angry Birds and Flappy Birds and little clicky pokey apps to pass the time, things that would not be thought of as dangerous or political at all. People who make spreadsheets, people who make weather apps, people who just wanted to create, family tree websites. All of them are being bought out, are being subverted, are being corrupted, are being incentivized into building capabilities into their platforms, into their apps that fundamentally work against the public and in the favor of some institution, wherever they happen to be. And they don't see the big picture largely because they see themselves at the atomic level, in the individual level. They see themselves in their office. They see themselves in their project. They see themselves in their unit. They see themselves in their sector. They don't see themselves as a part of the larger world. But the longer that we do that, the more and more problems are being created at scale, sub rosa, beneath our notice. But they're building up and aggregating until we see a catalyzing event like a George Floyd, where all of these people who didn't realize the impacts of all the things they did, all the politicians who made the votes to say, hey, all this leftover equipment from Iraq, why don't we give that to police departments? So, it goes to a positive use. And now suddenly you see that our police look like stormtroopers in a film, black uniforms, black guns, black everything. They're just missing the skulls on the helmets. And I think when everyone out there, when all of you, when everybody who's connected, wherever you are in the world right now, you're listening to this, you're thinking about this. I want you to think about the world. I want you to think about the news that you see in every day, and just think: did you agree to this? Does this represent you? Is this what you want? Is this how things should be? And I think, Congress would say that it doesn't matter, the majority one. The police would say you don't have a choice, stop resisting. And Facebook would say that you actually did consent. But I don't think you did. And I bet you don't think so either. They pretend that we consent. They pretend we agree because of where we were born, or where we have no choice but to live, or simply because we had to click that OK button in order to use our phone, in order to survive, in order to connect. So much of human experience exists behind gates, whether those are chain link fence, whether those are armed border points, whether it's the body scanner at TSA, whether it's the metal detector at Walmart, whether it's just the camera that's outside our apartment buildings. When we think about how this is changing from the physical control of our circumstances to the informatic control of our circumstances, this compilation of data, the way we interact, the way we get jobs, who gets a loan, who goes to school, all the decisions that impact our lives on the longest scale terms, the biggest decisions. These are, again, being intermediated, if not by technology, then informed by technology. And the people who are making those decisions are increasingly submitting or complementing their decision-making process with what the computer says. If they can't find you in the computer, God help you, because you don't exist. But the reality is, think about that moment. Think about that idea that you have consented to everything that Facebook does, which you had no idea because they don't announce it. It happens privately. It happens secretly in all these agreements that don't have any obligation to inform you about, because you clicked OK. You didn't know what you were agreeing to. You couldn't have known what you were agreeing to without reading all of this legalese, which the very first point of which is always these terms are subject to change at any time without notice. So you would be wasting your time if you read it. And just realizing that the world is becoming increasingly centralized. Everything that we're talking about, all of these conflicts are being driven in a real way by inequality. whether we're talking about access to medical care in a pandemic, whether we're talking about access to justice in a brutality crisis, right? There are haves and there are have-nots. And we see institutions, we see corporations are the haves, and increasingly the individual, the family, the community are the have-nots. And we ask, how did this come to be? Did we vote on that? Did we have any influence of that? And it intentionally happened behind closed doors. It intentionally happened quietly. It intentionally happened as part of an expert conversation that invented its own language, its own terms, its own structure to exclude us from, so that we could not engage in. And that's the economic argument, right? That's the idea that the government went to like fractional reserve lending and things like that, where if you think, there's an economy that exists of only three people, Alice, Bob, and Charlie. Each person only has $1. That's all the money that exists in the world. And Charlie starts a bank, right? Now, Charlie only has $1, but he can lend out more than $1 because he's running a bank. He loans that out on the basis of the deposits that he has in hand. He has now created money. He gives that to Alice, who wants to start a store. And now Alice owes whatever money she borrowed from Charlie, from the bank, plus more money that she has to either give up from what she had or get from Bob, because it has to come from somewhere. And no matter what the interactions are between Alice and Bob, no matter what they do, all these rounds of the game, eventually every interaction that they have with the bank, every interaction that they have with these privileged classes that can create money in ways that we can't, that can create power in ways that we can't, the bank ends up with more, and we end up with less. It is inevitable. It is how the system is designed. That dynamic is being replicated in technology now, where Google, Facebook, these guys have the first mover advantage. They know more about everyone than any of us. And in order to use your phone, you got to create a Gmail account, you got to sign into the Google store, you got to create an iTunes account, all of this stuff. Life, access to the electronic network, access to your friends, access to your family's pictures, all of these things are behind gates. And the price for admission to all of this data that you have a closer connection to than these companies do, the price for admission is your own data. You are being told that you have agreed, that you have consented to the creation of perfect records about your private lives by 1,000 companies and industries that you don't know, that you don't have a meaningful relationship, that you don't even pay. You don't understand how they work. You don't have a vote over this. They might not even be in your country. And yet you are subject to their policies. You are subject to their powers. You are subject to their prerogatives. And that's just commerce. When we talk about national power, when we talk about state power, when we move over history as technology advances, right? We need to understand how these powers are tested out. When we see what people are willing to tolerate, how much you can do before people really rebel and revolt and say, this is too far. Power is always applied first and most aggressively against the unprotected and minorities. They are the proving grounds because they are the ones with the least voice. They are the ones with the fewest friends. They are the ones that you can push around without expecting to get hit back hard enough that it will actually hurt, that it will shape your behavior. But the thing is, we've seen this over the last 2 decades in the war on terrorism happen in incredible ways, from the war on a religion, on a belief, on a system, and all the governments that come with it. Nobody cared when they created drones and they started flying them over Afghanistan and places like Yemen, CIA and NSA partnering on programs that were literally called shenanigans. And what they were doing was they were mapping all the cell phones of all the people in the city, seeing where they went to sleep, so they could know which cell phone belonged to which building if they wanted to bomb someone. And now, if we can bring up that flight map of Portland, we see these same technologies of flying circuits around a city to observe people, to observe devices, and they deny it in this way and that way, and maybe they aren't doing it this way or that way. But the technology exists, they have it, they buy it, they don't tell anybody about it. It's being procured, you see it in the budgets. And then every time there's a protest now, whether it's in Baltimore, whether it's in Portland, whether it's in Austin, There is a plane in the sky keeping an eye on us. And even if it's not, there's an eye in our pocket that we paid for that's keeping an eye on us. These technologies are forged in the war front, but they have a way of moving to the home front. And they're used against the disenfranchised. They're used against the people with the least. They're used against vulnerable minorities. And then they're used against everyone. Even if you feel like this doesn't affect you personally, it does, and it will in time. And we need to understand that, the pandemic will eventually recede. We do inevitably make progress towards a more just society on the backs of people that sacrificed their lives to win it for us. But the rights we lose to every emergency law that passes because we are afraid, we never get those back. Pandemic recedes, but the tide of rights, that recedes too. And I'll wrap this up because I'll cede my time to everybody else. I think I've said enough. I think we need to understand that when we talk about technologists, when we talk about people working at Facebook, when we talk about people on the street who are standing up and exposing themselves to violence, to protect other people from violence, this stuff matters. That is the only way the world gets better. It's not enough to read. It's not enough to believe in something. It's not enough to write something. You have to eventually stand for something if you want things to change. What is changing today is the fundamental structure in the relationship of the individual, the citizen, the non-citizen, to the institution, be it corporate or governmental. And it's very fashionable, I think, in the United States and a lot of developed countries generally, to think about corporations as arms of government. We see the chummy relationship. We see how much influence happens there. But when you think about who has the most influence over what laws get written and what laws get passed in the United States, I think we need to seriously consider that perhaps it's government that's becoming an arm of the corporation.
No, and that's I think one of the most important reminders in all of this. We have, had already gone into close to 2 hours of conversation and haven't even talked in depth about facial recognition technology. But I think this last point that you made in terms of how the same people that are creating the technology are trying to go to DC to write the laws is precisely what we're witnessing in this moment. And it's important to realize that. Well, thank you for that answer, Ed, and hope that tech workers are listening and understanding that it's not enough to simply believe in something, but actually take a stand for something. And if there are tech workers from any of the companies that we're targeting that want to reach out to us, let us know. We're ready. And so I guess we're very, very thankful for all of y'all's time, all of your input and insight into this conversation. We just want to wrap up and maybe have folks do a couple of minutes with very, very brief comments to just kind of with the spirit of the road ahead, right? Understanding that, for a lot of folks that are watching this, they're probably terrified at the level of surveillance that we're describing, really might be feeling small and tiny in terms of, again, the ginormous nature of the beast that we're confronting. But how do we make sense of this, and how do we continue to organize? I know, at least for me, it's been really important to remember that there have been many moments where government their power to both understand that are to fight for freedom and try to repress them and also use it to change the narrative. So we've been in very similar moments in other parts of history, just maybe not with technology in the same way. So just if you guys could maybe do a couple of closing comments, whatever ideas are coming out to you and helping inspire those movements to continue forward. Maybe Edward, if you could kick us off, and then Ed, and then finally with Naomi.
Sure. I think that, this moment, the pandemic will go away, and, something, an insight people should carry with them is that, during the pandemic, it was shown pretty explicitly how the convenience and a lot of the comfort that comes with the society that we have is built on, pretty extensive, exploitation of workers and contractors, built on surveillance of groups and social control of those groups, built on a lot of fundamentally undemocratic practices and techniques that are key to how these technologies, how these companies, how these modes of governance work. And going forth, past the pandemic, a lot of these platforms are going to come out stronger because of the reliance that people have had on them. And that strength that they're going to gain is also going to mean that their exploitation of those groups is going to get deeper. And so, in the moments that are going forward, in the days, the months, years, weeks, it's important to recognize that we have to rely on each other and save each other in this. And the only way we're going to get out of it is, together applying pressure in any way and in any weak point that we can. All of these systems are interconnected, whether it is the surveillance, systems that are in your neighborhood, whether it's the militarized cops that are in the neighborhood, whether it's the companies that have, relationships with the city or with the police departments to either privatize services or to redirect services. The only way that we are going to unmake this fundamentally broken world is by opposing every single manifestation and instance of these injustices, and not to succumb to the temptation or at times delusion that these companies, these actors, these forces are part of the solution.
Just jump back in that. It looks like you're having some technical difficulties, so if you want to go ahead.
That the systems that we have, it's masses of people languishing so that a few can thrive, and this is true in every single instance of almost every single instance of tech, almost every single instance of tech as it's invaded our social daily lives. And if we're going to make the world better, we have to push back against that in any way that we can. Some of the solutions require us to expand the imagination beyond, as Naomi talked about, the solution is not simply just, breaking up, these companies. It's also, putting strict limits on what you're even able to what you're even able to or allowed to collect and use, asking why these companies exist and prohibiting some things from existing in the first place, and also destroying things that do exist, and having to figure out ways to deal with, dynamics or relationships that we've grown used to having high-tech solutions or high-tech implements for. I think that just because a tool or technological implement has been advanced doesn't mean that there's a progression. Often there's been a regression because it's used to, distract from, the power dynamics that are going on there. And this is going to be, the PR that these companies deployed failed them miserably. And for some companies, the way forward will be to, go mask off and commit to, partnerships with the military, partnerships with the police. And others, it will be to find new ways and new legitimation narratives. But we have to remember, they're not on our side. Their very existence is antithetical in many respects to, what we all want, which is a life that isn't, just convenience, but flourishing, thriving, and being able to relate to each other in any way that we want, and not to just simply consume at their convenience so that they're able to continue to micro-target, micro-advertise, direct everybody and make a profit that way. They should be operating at the whims and at our leisure and at our, desire, not the other way around. And until we do that, or until we have that sort of animating focus and how we engage with these companies, they're always going to come up with a new lie, a new trick, a new distraction, a new justification. With 9/11, they were able to use that to hypercharge the surveillance state, and they're definitely going to use the pandemic to hypercharge their integration into everyday life. And it's up to us to resist that, overcome it, and try to imagine alternatives, because the tech and the data and the algorithms that are all privately owned, the networks that are all privately owned, if we could take control of them, the public, whatever way that looks like, then we could radically improve life for most people. But the way that they are constructed right now, they're used to surveil people. They're used to maintain an unequal distribution of resources and to use violence to preserve that unequal status quo. And we should not be interested in preserving such a violent and immoral system.
I think the point that Edward made about new legitimation narratives, and Naomi brought this up a little bit earlier, about the structural threat to companies, like how they respond to this, how they show support, and then the parties largely, they're entirely willing to provide lip service. If the only thing that they feel that is demanded of them, of a social movement, is to change their language, is to issue a press release, is to put out an ad campaign, they are all behind that. They're like, oh, we are the ally of allies. We're here for you all the way. As long as it doesn't impact their business, as long as it doesn't impact their power, as long as it doesn't impact their operations, they're on side with it. But we need to think about, again, what are the roots of the inequality that's driving all of these crises to the fore, that is making problems into crises. And I think that goes all through this, whether we're talking about economy, whether we're talking about political expression, whether we are talking about access to justice, whether we are talking about freedom from violence. All of these things centrally revolve around the axis of power. And again, that's very much true in surveillance. It's about control. It's about who has influence over society. And that is what the struggles today truly represent. We have an indentured generation that has been told they will be working for the rest of their lives just to break even on the mistakes of the last. And that generation doesn't want to be accountable for it. They refuse even responsibility for it. And the members of that generation who are on the right side of history, they aren't the ones who call the shots. They aren't the ones that have power. And I think it's important to remember that this is a constant theme throughout history. There were people who saw injustice as it was developing and called it injustice and stood up against it. And they were minimized, they were crushed, they were marginalized again and again and again, but they didn't stop. And eventually they built a critical mass. Eventually they built a movement. Eventually they coordinated. Eventually they organized. And eventually they persuaded the whole of society, the whole of history, that what had just moments ago been normal was now unspeakable. And it's just, I'll end on a historic note here because I've gone too long. It's important to remember that connection between the development of new and controversial powers, abilities, authorities, laws, and the close to immediate application of them against minorities, and particularly blacks in the United States. That's our history. In her book, Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness, I think it was, Simone Brown wrote that the first American surveillance laws were lantern laws that required black, mixed, and indigenous people to literally carry candlelit lanterns after sunset to make them easier to watch as they went about whatever it was, anytime they were not in the company of a white person. Effectively, any visible minority, and this is back in the 17th century, in New York, who wasn't literally lighting themselves up, was subject to be stopped and frisked. We need to create a world where people who aren't exactly like us, from ways big to ways small, are subjects rather than equals. You know, this whole idea of government, this whole idea of democracy, it only works when we all have a seat at the table. And there's this fundamental presumption, particularly in these fractious times, with this sort of new rising authoritarianism, that they believe, well, as long as you have the majority, everything's okay. But the majority can't vote away the rights of the minority, or they weren't rights. And it's important for us to remember that.
Thank you, Ed. Naomi, take us home.
Sure. I'm feeling the extreme possibility of my 8-year-old barging in any second now, but I'm going to try. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. And, you know, I've been writing about the shock doctrine now for almost 2 decades, unfortunately. And, you know, that book was a book of history about how this has been used again and again, right? And the idea of governments using moments of trauma to push through their pre-existing wish list is pretty ancient. But we've been seeing a very particular manifestation of it in the neoliberal era. And, you know, I think that it's fair, seeing as Anna Tijoux gave us her music, to acknowledge that it started in Chile as the first real laboratory for these ideas in the aftermath of the Pinochet coup, another September 11th. You know, and having spent a lot of time studying not just the tactic, but the resistance movements to it, some successful, some not, there's a couple things that I've found. And you know, one of them I mentioned recently, that you know, in those moments where they tell us that we cannot protest, where they try to ban our most basic liberties, that is the moment when we have to flood the streets. You know, I lived in Argentina for a couple of years, and there was a moment in 2001 when they declared a state of siege, and it was because of looting of supermarkets in a deep economic crisis in the sort of exurbs of Buenos Aires. And when Fernando de la Rua, the then president of Argentina, went onto the radio and declared a state of siege and told everybody to stay in their homes and imposed a curfew, he didn't make it through the speech before the sound of pots and pans drowned him out, because Argentinians knew their history, and they before he had finished telling them to stay in their homes, the plazas were filled with millions of people. And so we need to know that history. We have to understand this is global. And another lesson I've learned from studying this history is that when we are in these moments where shocks and traumas are being used to accelerate the advancement of that corporate wish list, it is incredibly important to reject it and say no. But because the crises are real that we're talking about, you know, I'm not so sanguine about the pandemic. I think we're going to be living with it for a long time. I know we're going to be living with climate change. I know we are going to be living with an incredibly unstable financial system. I know this unemployment crisis isn't going anywhere. So it isn't only enough to just say no to their shitty ideas. It isn't only enough to say no to, you know, the introduction of workplace software under cover of social distancing that is going to prevent union organizing because it's not going to allow people to talk to their coworkers, right? Yeah, we have to say no, but we also have to present real alternatives for how we're going to live, right? Not just little things, but actually a different vision of society. One that rejects this techno-solutionism and says, no, we need to rebuild a way of being that puts the health of people and the planet at the center. And, you know, Jacinta, you talked about people feeling small in this moment and feeling overwhelmed by what they're hearing. Let's not forget that after 3 months of many people being isolated in their homes and following social distancing orders, and other people working harder than they'd ever worked before because their work was deemed essential, even as they were treated as sacrificial. The thing that brought tens and even hundreds of thousands of people out of their homes to engage in some kind of mass activity was not going to the mall or getting their nails done. That was a small minority. That was a small group of people. For a much larger group of people in the United States and around the world, the first collective act that they engaged in was protest, was taking real risk, standing up for Black lives, standing up against police barbarism and anti-Blackness, and rallying behind a call to defund the police. And that is really important because it is a radical call. It is drawing on the scholarship of people like Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who are providing a sweeping vision of a different way to live. It is not a narrow policy demand. It is a completely different definition of how we treat one another and the planet, right? Where we invest after we divest, right? And I think that that is intimately connected to how we're going to respond to this pandemic, because we're going to be hearing more and more bad ideas about how we have to accept more surveillance and more control, right? When in fact, the real solutions are really going to be about investing in people. And I mentioned the way actual contact tracing works. We have massive community health corps, hiring people rooted in communities that are about supporting people to do what is necessary to keep themselves and their communities safe. We can have a modern day civilian conservation corps that creates millions of jobs planting trees and we can do it in ways that are actually safe in terms of controlling the spread of the virus. It's pretty easy to do that, much easier than a workplace where people are coming in and out of every single day. If we're at a point where we're questioning the existence of prisons, we can question the existence of borders. Moments of crisis are malleable moments. This is the last thing I just want to say. Things are in play right now. They're going to change in a big way. And here I think Arundhati Roy's framing about the pandemic as a portal is really important, because she reminds us, right, that we're going somewhere different than we were before. It could be a lot worse. It could be a lot better. It depends on what we do now. We're not going back to where we were before. Things are very much in play, right? So let's take heart from the fact that we flooded out of our homes and we found each other in this moment, that we stood up for justice after so much time in isolation, that there's some kind of vulnerability, collective vulnerability, that was unveiled by this experience, and build on that. So yeah, I think I'll end there and thank all of you for your organizing, for your wisdom, but most of all your organizing, because nothing happens without organizing. We can talk all day. And yeah, it's just been a real privilege. And all of you who tuned in, thank you so much. Support Mi Gente, because if this is the first time you're learning about them, they are amazing, incredible organizers, and so are all of the groups that partnered to pull this event off. It's been really fun.
Thank you so much for landing it there, Naomi. That was exactly the right place where we wanted to end this conversation in, because as many of you mentioned throughout the conversation, this is about power, right? And as organizers, we know that the only thing that we can do to respond to this moment is build more power on the other side, build more people power that can actually put forward the demands that we need in this moment, whether it's around abolishing ICE, whether it's around defunding the police, whether it's reimagining the internet so it can be a place of connection and not a place of extraction and attack. You know, these are all conversations that I think are very much live in our movements. And, you know, we do want to take the opportunity to invite people in. If this is the first time you're learning about this, this is the first time learning about the campaign, please step in. You know, at No Tech for ICE, we have tools. If you're a tech worker, if you're a student, if you are a frontline community that needs to figure out how to break this down for your members, if you are a policy person who wants to think about the best way to approach this in your city, all of those resources are there. And also an invitation to all of the Latino, Latinas, Latines, Latinxes that are watching this. This is our time to become members of organizations, enter into political home, and really squat up, because the moment definitely needs it. So again, thank you for everyone for participating. Really, really appreciate your work and your insights on this. And yeah, looking forward to the next conversation. So thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Quien quiere libertad, pero la quiere muy purita, muy blanquita. Y esa no es la que amerita, esa es purita, lo contrario yo la quiero. Para los chamacos de los barrios que solo se le aseguró el sistema carcelario. Quien quiere libertad, pero la quiere macharrana, con la pareja encerrada entre cocina, laundry, cama, ropa con sotana, escapate por la ventana, dile que desayuno en Juana. Digo libertad y hay quien dice Nueva York, y si digo justicia dicen que ciega es mejor. Hay quien quiere libertad pero no la necesita porque tiene cuanto quiere. La cosa se complica si no aboga por cortar la soga que ahoga al otro. ¿Hasta dónde? Dime hasta dónde. ¿Hasta dónde? Dime hasta dónde. ¿Hasta dónde? Dime hasta dónde. ¿Hasta dónde llega tú nosotros? Yo quiero libertad, pero la quiero completa, con justicia para las pobres, las maricas y las prietas. No hables de libertad si le exige muy purita, muy blanquita. Esa no es la que amerita. Yo quiero libertad, pero la quiero completa, con justicia para las pobres indocumentadas. Esa, no hables de libertad si le exige muy purita, muy blanquita. Esa no es la que amerita. Yo quiero libertad, pero no la defino como librarme del vecino para ser como el vecino, sino la necesidad de andar otro camino porque el viejo se minó algo.